They were beginning to call him the Butcher. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had been battling his way south since May of 1864. Fiercely opposed by the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, Grant hurled his divisions at Southern defensive positions again and again. In the murky depths of the wilderness, against the bristling fieldworks at Spotsylvania, along the banks of the North Anna River, and across the blood-soaked fields of Cold Harbor, legions of men in Federal blue gave their lives in appalling numbers. As the two armies settled into siege around Richmond and Petersburg, the North counted nearly 70,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. This was more than Robert E. Lee had started the campaign with in the Southern ranks, and the people of the North began to grow weary of the slaughter. But the war was not over yet, and Grant knew that more sacrifices would be required by his army before the thing could be brought to a close. He was not pleased with the prospect of a long siege for the Southern capital and constantly sought ways to break it. One of these efforts would become symbolic of the war effort thus far. It proved to be a triumph of Yankee engineering, offset by the failure of Union leadership and defeated by the resourcefulness of Confederate response. It was known to all as the Crater. The longest tunnel in military history to that date was dug by some Pennsylvania miners and filled with 4 tons of powder. In the early dawn hours of July 30th, 1864, the mine was exploded. Though the Confederate lines had been breached, Federal soldiers poured in and around the hole without some of their division commanders, who sat behind their own lines drinking. White and black soldiers alike were sacrificed needlessly, as the rebel forces quickly recovered and lined the rim of the crater, pouring a devastating fire into the bluecoats within. A few hours later, 4,000 Yankees lay dead or captured. The Southern defenses remained intact. A Union general lost his command, and Grant's men settled in for a long and tedious siege. The Union forces gradually extended their lines westward around Petersburg, cutting Southern supply routes and stretching the Confederate manpower resources to the breaking point. The bloodied fields around Richmond and Petersburg were not the only place that the South was being strangled. Since 1863, the northern blockade of Southern ports had been increasingly effective, and basic supplies were becoming scarce and expensive. Rampant inflation had rendered the Confederate currency nearly worthless. The Western Confederate Army, in a disastrous campaign under John Bell Hood, had been shattered at the battles of Franklin and Nashville. Union General William T. Sherman's march from Atlanta to Savannah had scoured the countryside clean of crops and animals and left much of Georgia and the Carolinas in ruins. Cut off since 1863, the Confederate states west of the Mississippi River could offer little assistance to their sister states in the east. While pockets of resistance still held out in southern Alabama and the Trans-Mississippi, the area of the struggling southern nation that still remained under control of Richmond had been effectively reduced to the state of Virginia and a small portion of North Carolina, where Joseph E. Johnston's small army tried valiantly to hold Sherman back. In March 1865, Johnston carefully laid a trap for his adversary as Sherman's separated columns tramped through the state. Waiting near Bentonville on March 19th, Johnston caught his enemy in the open with a savage attack. The early success of the rebels was quickly countered by the stubborn resistance of the Federals and the timely arrival of Sherman's remaining forces. The battle was basically a draw, and the badly outnumbered Johnston withdrew from the field. They had taken their best and last shot and could do no more. In Virginia, Lee's army was in little better shape. Grant's strategy had cut off all but a single remaining rail line leading into Petersburg, the South Side Railroad. In late March, Grant sent Philip Sheridan to sever this final lifeline. Lee anticipated this move, however, and sent George Pickett with 5 brigades to stop him. On April 1st, Sheridan attacked Pickett's lines at the Five Forks Road junction. Although the initial Federal assaults went awry, the Yankees corrected the mistake and closed in on Pickett's flank from 3 sides. The Confederate line collapsed, and Pickett's command was shattered. 5,000 rebels ended up as prisoners. It was the break Grant had been waiting for. He immediately ordered a general assault the next day. April 2nd saw the end of the Petersburg siege. Grant attacked in many places at once, and the thin gray line could not stop them. Withdrawing to the innermost defensive lines, Lee determined to escape before he was completely trapped. His thinking was to move west, consolidate the Richmond and Petersburg garrisons at Amelia Courthouse, then turn south to join forces with Johnston in Carolina. If he could steal a march on Grant, he just might have time to defeat Sherman before Grant could come to his aid. The entire plan hinged on speed and having enough time. But such a plan was wishful thinking on Lee's part. His men were weak and dispirited. Many were sickly and would never survive such a journey, much less win a battle quickly. Furthermore, even united with Johnston, Lee would still be facing a superior enemy in Sherman's 100,000 well-fed veterans. It was a desperate plan, but it was characteristically bold and optimistic, and it was Lee's only hope. The movement got underway in the evening hours of April 2nd. Lee had ordered supplies collected at Amelia Courthouse, but the order was somehow never transmitted, and the food didn't arrive. The Army found artillery and ammunition, but no food. Lee elected to give the troops a day to collect forage from the countryside. The slim margin of time that was so precious was slipping away. Grant reacted quickly and put Sheridan and his cavalry on the western road south of the Appomattox River, with orders to stay between Lee and the Carolinas. The infantry was then split into two columns and sent after the rebels. The Yankees could sense that victory was close and the pursuit was vigorous. The Confederate column was marching west with Longstreet's corps in the lead, followed by Richard Anderson's and Richard Ewell's corps. Next came the Confederate wagon trains, who were guarded by Gordon's corps at the tail of the army. The Federals were following in three groups. On the heels of Gordon's men and skirmishing constantly with them was the Second Corps under Humphreys. To the north of this column was Griffin's Fifth Corps. Further south, Sheridan's cavalry was racing west to block the Confederate column, and Wright's Sixth Corps was following the Federal cavalry. Some distance south of Sheridan was the 24th Corps under Gibbon, with one division of the 25th Corps attached. The 9th Corps under Parke was spread out along the South Side Railroad. As Lee's column twisted and turned to find the best route west, the Federals, led by Humphreys' men, followed them closely. The more southerly column was able to move towards the west in a straighter line and gradually gained ground on the rebels. Near the town of Farmville, a tall structure known as High Bridge crossed the Appomattox River. A group of Yankee horsemen and infantry got there before the Confederates, and Confederate cavalry had to scramble to chase them off. In the middle of the column, Ewell feared for the safety of the trains. He ordered them to take a different road, and Gordon's men, charged with their protection, took the same route. The Federal vanguard under Humphreys followed Gordon. Now Ewell was at the rear of the column, and Wright's Federal Sixth Corps, who had closed up on them, was fast approaching. It was April 6, 1865, and Ewell determined to make a stand near a small stream known to local residents as Sailor's Creek. Ewell's brigades deployed at the top of a hill, southwest of the stream, sending some of Kershaw's men forward to contest the Federal advance. Ewell was outnumbered 3-1, and Anderson's men, under attack from Sheridan, were unable to detach themselves and come to his aid. Without artillery, without hope of reinforcement, Ewell grimly dug in as best he could. The Federals coming at him were from Truman Seymour's and Frank Wheaton's divisions of the Sixth Corps. These were hardened veterans, perhaps some of the best in the Army of the Potomac, and they were supported by nearly 24 pieces of artillery. Kershaw's men were unable to deter the Federal advance and soon withdrew. At approximately 5 p.m., the Federal artillery, posted near the house of a farmer named Hillsman, made its presence felt. Ewell and Anderson were debating whether to withdraw when the Federal infantry began to advance. As they began to close the distance between them and the Confederates, some of the Federals waved white handkerchiefs at the rebels, calling on them to surrender. The Confederates would not hear of it, however, and said so in no uncertain terms. The Confederate volley devastated the front rank of the Federals, and they fell back in some confusion. The rebels seized on the opportunity and counterattacked. The momentum of the charge carried the fighting to the banks of the creek, and for a time it looked like the Federal effort had been beaten back. But the flanks of the Confederates were exposed, and Yankees left and right swung their guns around and opened fire. Now the Yankees regrouped and came on again. The rebels fought bravely, but the issue was never really in question. Gray soldiers began surrendering in droves. To the south, Merritt's cavalry had overrun Anderson's position with repeated charges, and the Confederate rear guard was nearly demolished. Further north, the train stalled near the creek crossing, and Gordon's men found Humphreys' men pressing in on them. In a panic, the Southerners swarmed across the creek, abandoning the wagons, and many of them dropping their weapons as well. In a single day, the already weakened rebel army had suffered 8,000 casualties and lost most of its meager supplies. Surveying the scene, Lee cried out in despair, "My God, has the army dissolved?" In the aftermath, Sheridan sent a dispatch to Grant stating that, "If the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender." Grant forwarded the message to Lincoln, who quickly wired back, "Let the thing be pressed." Some of the dwindling remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Appomattox River over the high bridge near Farmville. The soldiers ordered to destroy the bridge were slow in obeying the order, and only a section was burned before the Federals arrived to save it. Lee took up positions on the north side of the river to meet the expected attack, and another half day was lost in the indecisive fighting. That evening, April 7th, Grant sent a dispatch to Lee.
The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia.
On the evening of April 8th, cavalry under George Custer captured several railroad trains filled with supplies for Lee that had arrived at Appomattox Station from Lynchburg. Custer's presence also signaled to the Confederates that the Federals were now in front of them as well as behind. That same night, Lee summoned his generals and suggested surrender. They disagreed, saying that the Southern infantry could sweep aside the Union cavalry. It was agreed that Gordon would attack in the morning. The attack got underway at dawn. As expected, the Yankee horsemen gave way under pressure from the attacking rebel lines. As Gordon's men reached the crest of a low hill, they were met with a vision that took the heart out of them. There on the opposite hill were 20,000 infantrymen of Edward Ord's Army of the James and 15,000 veterans of Griffin's 5th Corps filing into line. The road west was completely blocked, and the weakened Confederates had no hope of breaking out. When Lee received the news that Federal infantry in strength blocked the way, he sadly acknowledged the inevitable.
Then there's nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I had rather die 1,000 deaths.
By 8:30 a.m., Lee had sent a dispatch to Grant requesting a ceasefire and a meeting, and rode off to meet between the lines. Grant replied by sending a staff officer, Orville Babcock, ahead to set up the meeting and followed with his staff. After meeting Babcock, Lee sent his trusted aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, into the town of Appomattox Courthouse to find a suitable spot for the meeting to take place. This small town was located on the road between Richmond and Lynchburg and was chiefly known for being the county seat, with a courthouse, county offices, and a jail. April 9, 1865 was Palm Sunday, and some of its 75 residents were in the streets, although the nearby firing had convinced many of the more prudent to remain in their houses. Now their quiet neighborhood was about to host one of the most important meetings in American history. Colonel Marshall rode into town and asked the first civilian he saw to assist him in finding a place for Lee and Grant to meet. By an incredible coincidence, that civilian turned out to be Wilmer McLean, a local businessman who had once owned a farm near Manassas. In 1861, the Battle of Bull Run had raged over his fields, and sometime in 1862, he purchased the house in Appomattox, promising his family that, "Here the sound of battle will never reach you." But the war had found him again, and what had started in his front yard was about to end in his front room. A short while later, Lee, in company with Babcock and Sergeant Tucker, arrives at the house. Lee is splendidly dressed in a new uniform with sash, gloves, polished boots, and a magnificent sword. About 30 minutes later, Grant arrives with several members of his staff, including the Chief of Cavalry, Philip Sheridan, Chief of Staff, John Rawlins, Inspector General Seth Williams, his adjutant, Theodore Bowers, an aide, Horace Porter, and his military secretary, Eli Parker, a full-blooded Native American. In contrast to Lee, Grant wears a casual sack coat, no sword or gloves, and mud-spattered boots. As they mount the steps, Grant motions to his staff to wait outside while he greets Lee inside. Their first moments together set the tone for the talks to come.
I met you once before, General Lee, while we were serving in Mexico. You came over from General Scott's headquarters to visit Garland's brigade, to which I then belonged. I've always remembered your appearance, and I think I should have recognized you anywhere.
Yes, I know I met you on that occasion, and I've often thought of it and tried to recall how you looked, but I have never been able to remember a single feature.
Grant is somewhat stung by this mild insult, but the two men continue to discuss the Mexican War while Grant's staff files in. With them is a civilian newspaper correspondent, Sylvanus Cadwallader. Grant is stalling with this talk of Mexico. Lee decides to get the meeting down to the business at hand.
I suppose, General Grant, the object of our present meeting is fully understood. I asked to see you to ascertain upon what conditions you would receive the surrender of my army.
The terms I propose are those as stated substantially in my letter of yesterday. That is, the officers and men surrendered to be paroled, disqualified from taking up arms again until properly exchanged. And all arms, ammunition, and supplies are to be delivered up as captured property.
Those are about the conditions I expected would be proposed.
Yes, I think our correspondence has indicated pretty clearly the action to be taken at our meeting today. And I hope it may lead to a general suspension of hostilities and be the means of preventing any further loss of life.
I presume, General Grant, we have both considered the proper steps to be taken. I would suggest that you formally commit to writing the terms you have proposed so that they may be formally acted upon.
Very well. I'll write them out.
Taking his order book from Theodore Bowers, Grant pauses momentarily and then proceeds to write out the terms in pencil.
Each company or regimental commander sign a like parole for the men of their commands. The arms, artillery, and public property to be parked and stacked.
As he writes, Grant glances over at the beautiful sword that Lee is wearing and spontaneously decides to permit all the officers in Lee's army to retain their sidearms. It is a generous concession designed to spare Lee the further humiliation of surrendering his sword, as is the custom in these circumstances.
This will not embrace the sidearms of the officers, nor their private horses or baggage. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles and the laws in force where they may reside.
When he finishes, Grant hands the book to Parker, who passes it to General Lee. As Grant had done earlier, now Lee seems to stall. He carefully and deliberately sets the book down. He takes out his glasses. He meticulously and slowly cleans them with his handkerchief. Then he picks up the book and begins to read.
Rolls of all the officers and men to be made in duplicate. One copy to be given to an officer designated by me. The other to be retained by such officer or officers as you
As
may
Lee
designate.
reads, he notices an omission in the text and points it out.
After the words "until properly," the word "exchange" seems to be omitted. You doubtless intended to use that word.
Why, yes, I thought I had put in exchanged.
I presumed it had been omitted inadvertently, and with your permission, I will mark where it should be inserted.
Certainly.
Lee searches for a pencil, but finds he does not have one. Grant's aide, Horace Porter, immediately comes to his rescue, offering him one of his own. Lee makes his correction and continues reading. When he finishes, Lee looks up, relieved.
This will have a very happy effect upon my army.
Unless you have some suggestions to make in regard to the form in which I've stated the terms, I will have a copy made in ink and sign it.
There is one thing I would like to mention. The cavalrymen and artillerists own their own horses in our army. Its organization differs in that respect from the United States. I would like to understand whether these men will be permitted to retain their horses.
You will find the terms as written do not allow this. Only officers are permitted to keep their private property.
No, I see the terms do not allow it. That is clear.
This causes some consternation among Grant's staff, as such a concession was clearly beyond the normal scope of acceptable surrender terms. Without asking directly, Lee has put Grant on the spot. Grant compromises.
This subject is quite new to me. Of course, I didn't know that any private soldiers own their animals. I will not change the terms as written, but I will instruct the officers I shall appoint to receive the paroles to let all the men who claim to own a horse or a mule take that animal home with them to work their little farms.
This will have the best possible effect upon my men. It will be very gratifying and will do much towards conciliating our people.
Marshall returns the book to Grant, who hands it to Bowers and directs him to copy it in ink. Bowers is too nervous to comply, however, and
Eli?
Grant passes it to Eli Parker instead. Parker finds that McLean's ink bottle has become thickened and cannot be used. As Porter had done for Lee, Marshall now comes to the rescue and steps forward with a pen and ink and loans it to Parker to permit the final document to be written. Lee then instructs Marshall to draft a formal acceptance letter. Outside, a small group of curious townspeople has gathered in the street, aware that something momentous is taking place, and a steady stream of federal dispatch riders and messengers are coming and going as the meeting progresses. Thundering up the road comes George Custer, the impetuous cavalryman, who had earlier that day confronted James Longstreet in a stormy exchange. Far exceeding his authority, Custer had demanded the unconditional surrender of the Confederate Army, and Longstreet had sent him on his way brusquely. Now he arrives late to the meeting and is forced to remain outside on the porch. Inside, the documents are completed and the formal acceptance is being signed. No single surrender document is drawn up, but the terms are proposed and accepted in the form of dispatches from each side to the other. When both are signed and exchanged, the surrender is complete. But Lee is not quite finished with Grant yet.
I have 1,000 or more of your men as prisoners, General Grant, a number of them being officers whom we have required to march along with us the last several days. I would be glad to send them into your lines as soon as it could be arranged, for I have no provisions for them. I have indeed nothing for my own men. They have been living for the past several days principally upon parched corn, and we are badly in need of both rations and forage. I telegraphed to Lynchburg requesting several train loads of rations to be sent on by rail from there. And when they arrive, I would be glad to have the present wants of my men supplied from them.
Grant's staff is astonished. Sheridan's cavalry had captured the very trains Lee is referring to the night before. They cannot believe that Lee does not know this, yet he seems to be implying just that. Lee was maneuvering Grant into one additional concession. Once again, Grant rises to the occasion.
I should like to have our men sent within our lines as soon as possible. I will take steps to have your army supplied with provisions. I'm sorry, but we have no forage for the animals. We have had to depend on the country for our own supply of forage. Of about how many men does your present force consist?
Indeed, I am not able to say. We have had heavy losses in killed and wounded, and there have been some stragglers and deserters.
Suppose I send over 25,000 rations. Do you think that's sufficient?
I think it will be ample, and it will be a great relief, I assure you.
With the formalities concluded, Lee departs the house. He pauses at the top of the stairs and slaps his gloves in his hand 3 times. Then he descends the steps with Marshall and the Union generals following. As they turn to leave, Grant silently raises his hat in salute, and his staff follows his lead. Lee returns the salute and rides off slowly to rejoin his army. Grant and his officers watch the departure with a mixture of sadness and relief. For Lee and his men, there can be only one emotion. Their country is defeated, their dreams of independence shattered, their homes and countryside ravaged, many of their comrades gone forever. The future holds only darkness and suffering. As Lee returns to his lines, his men surround him, asking if they are surrendered. Lee rides forward, alone in his sorrow, and the bravery of his ragged men only sadden him further. He knows what lies ahead, and his heart goes out to them. There are some units who choose not to surrender their flags. The 14th South Carolina Regiment elects to bury their colors in an emotional ceremony rather than give them up.
Gentlemen.
The Federals have a very different reaction. When General Meade gets the news, he climbs from his ambulance, leaps on a horse, and rides the line shouting the news. The men's response is indescribable. On April 12, 1865, 4 years to the day from the firing on Fort Sumter, the Union 5th Corps, led by Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, marches into the streets of Appomattox Courthouse to receive the surrender of Lee's men. The 13,000 veterans march silently to their duty. They have seen years of vicious combat with the men they are about to face, and they keep their thoughts to themselves. Years later, Chamberlain recorded his thoughts about the sight of these battle-scarred units filing by with the measured tread of professional soldiers.
Great memories and great thoughts went forward. We formed along a principal street to face the last line of battle and receive the arms and colors of that great army. We were remnants also. Massachusetts, Maine, Michigan, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York. Veterans and replaced veterans, cut to pieces, cut down, consolidated, divisions into brigades, regiments into one.
The Union men have not long to wait before the gray legions begin to appear. The 25,000 remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia march in without drums or music to their final formation. In the front of the lead division is John B. Gordon. As his column approaches the waiting Federals, Chamberlain orders the Yankees to go to the position of "carry arms," the sign of salute. Gordon returns the salute, and his men march in with heads held high and their ragged banners flying proudly. Shortly before the formal surrender of arms, Lee had sent a farewell message to each of the units that was read to them by their commanding officers. No doubt for many of them, the words rang in their hearts as they stacked their weapons for the last time.
After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. I need not tell the brave survivors of so many hard-fought battles who have remained steadfast to the last that I have consented to the result from no distrust of them, but feeling that valor and devotion could accomplish nothing that would compensate for the loss that may have attended the continuation of the contest. I determined to avoid the useless sacrifice of those whose past services have endeared them to their countrymen. By the terms of the agreement, officers and men can return to their homes and remain until exchange. You will take with you the satisfaction that proceeds from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed, and I earnestly pray that a merciful God will extend to you his blessings and protection. With an unceasing admiration for your constancy and devotion to your country, and a grateful remembrance of your kind and generous considerations for myself, I bid you all an affectionate farewell.
The condition of many of Lee's men is pitiful. Their battle flags are grouped tightly together as the fractional pieces of regiments march only a few feet apart. Many are wearing only fragments of uniforms. General Gordon described the sight. Men were wholly unfit for duty, in worn-out shoes and ragged uniforms, but with proud mien, they challenged the admiration of the brave victors. When the proud and sensitive sons of Dixie came to a full realization of the truth, they could no longer control their emotions, and tears ran down their shrunken faces. Chamberlain also recognized the sense of camaraderie that the Yankees felt for their defeated brethren.
Before us, in proud humiliation, stood the embodiment of manhood. Men whom neither toil and suffering, nor the fact of death, nor disaster, nor hopelessness could bend from their resolve. Standing before us now, thin, worn, and famished, but erect, with eyes looking level into ours, waking memories that bound us together as no other bond. Was not such manhood to be welcomed back into a union so tested and assured?
For days, the printing and distributing of paroles goes on. Lee's men drift away in groups and by themselves. For weeks, they will be journeying home. They know there is little to return to, but return they must. The proud brigades of the Army of Northern Virginia melt away into the countryside. Although the rifles of the soldiers are empty and silent, there is one weapon that is still to be fired. The evening of April the 14th, President Abraham Lincoln attends a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The assassination stuns the entire country and sends the Southern leaders hoping for lenience into a deep depression. Reconstruction now promises to be long and painful, as indeed it turned out to be. In North Carolina, the word of Lee's surrender gradually filters through to Johnston's army facing Sherman. Johnston knows that further resistance is pointless. 2 weeks after Lee's men had immortalized the courthouse in Virginia, Sherman and Johnston meet outside Durham in the house of a farmer named Bennett. Over the next few months, the remaining Confederate forces give up the fight. In the northern capital, 250,000 troops marched triumphantly past President Andrew Johnson and the people of Washington.
We may despise the rebel as religiously as good sense will permit. But the considerate man can never forget that the South is part and parcel of our common country, and that the recent rebels are now our countrymen.
The bloodiest chapter in American history has come to a close. 600,000 men are dead. Hundreds of thousands more are maimed or scarred for life. Millions of acres of land have been ravaged or destroyed. Entire cities lay in ruins. For the next 12 years, federal troops will occupy at least some part of the South. America had come of age. It had passed through its fiery adolescence and found its place in the world as a united country with a strong central government. It would grow to one of the world's great powers. But for now, it is a grieving widow. It has lost the flower of a generation, and the entire nation weeps for its lost sons.